What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Arbenz particularly, terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland at the onset of World War II, and just rendered everybody paralyzed.
Shortly after the coup in Iran, the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala was similarly overthrown. When Arbenz took office, 2.2% of Guatemalans owned 70% of the arable land. Arbenz programs included giving away uncultivated land grants to around 100,000 landless peasants. He also instituted a program of support for union rights and other basic reforms. Arbenz is best described as a moderate progressive, not a Marxist, yet his programs were met with outrage in Washington. Especially concerned were shareholders of Rockefeller's United Fruit Company. Under the dictator Jorge Ubico, United Fruit had established control of 42% of Guatemala's land and was exempted from taxes and import duties.
The United Fruit Company really owned half the country, literally, and only a third of the land at the million-acre plantations, only a third of it was cultivated. On the other hand, you had several hundreds of thousands of landless Indian workers, rural workers, who were in dire poverty.
The case of United Fruit presents a particularly glaring example of the evolving symbiotic relationship between powerful corporations and the American state. CIA Director Allen Dulles belonged to United Fruit's law firm and held shares in the company. John Morris Cabot, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, was the brother of a former United Fruit president, and President Eisenhower's personal secretary was married to the head of United Fruit's Public Relations Department. Clearly, Arbenz had to go. The problem was that he was not a communist, nor did his government have any links to the Soviet Union. In fact, Guatemala didn't even have diplomatic relations with Russia. The solution came by way of a man named Edward Bernays. Known as the father of public relations, Bernays was a major figure in the development of advertising and propaganda.
Eddie Bernays is known as the father spin or the father of public relations. Fascinating individual. He was double nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he actually learned fundamental techniques of human psychology and the ability to manipulate and manage human behavior from Uncle Sigmund. And he, at the same time, publicized and promoted Uncle Sigmund in the United States, and then aggrandized himself with his association with his uncle. Eddie Bernays believed that fundamentally democracy was untenable and that people are just too stupid to govern ourselves in a democracy. And so his rationalization was that there needed to be this elite of guardians, if you will, of public policy and public opinion who would manage society, and that the public relation practitioner would be a professional who would work for government and industry in managing and manipulating and doing what Eddie called engineering consent. In the 1930s, a journalist friend of Eddie Bernays by the name of Karl van Wiegen came back from Nazi Germany, and he had interviewed Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister. And he said to his friend Eddie Bernays, "Eddie, Joseph Goebbels has an even bigger propaganda library than yours, and he reads and uses all your books." And when Sheldon Rampton and I were writing about this in the 90s, we wrote a passage saying that we sort of wondered if maybe at some point Bernays, a liberal Jewish intellectual, began to realize that this technique of manipulating and managing public opinion and behavior that he thought was essential to preserve democracy might not just as easily be used in the wrong hands to subvert democracy. That question we raised was sort of answered later for us when we found out that indeed Bernays was completely comfortable helping to engineer and manage this overthrow of the elected government of Guatemala, and he was well aware of what had resulted from that.
Bernays' strategy was to take the anti-communist model used during the coup in Iran and turn it into a media blitz. Bernays was offered huge sums of money to develop a propaganda campaign against Arbenz and the people of Guatemala. Shortly before the coup, articles began appearing in the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Herald Tribune, Newsweek, Time, The New Leader, and other publications concerning the growing influence of Guatemala's communists. Guatemala was the new battleground in the war against the Soviets.
In Guatemala, the Jacob Arbenz regime became increasingly communistic after its inauguration in 1951. Communists in the Congress and high governmental positions controlled major committees, labor and farm groups, and propaganda facilities. They agitated and led in demonstrations against neighboring countries and the United States.
And Arbenz was overthrown in order to restore to power a right-wing regime. And from 1954 to 1990, when some sort of a peace accord was signed, 225,000 Indians mostly were murdered in Guatemala by the CIA-installed military regime. So it was a victory for the U.S. in the Cold War, but it was a terrible genocidal situation in Guatemala, finally recognized, at least verbally, by Clinton, who actually apologized to the Guatemalan people for the destruction which resulted from the U.S. military coup.
This is the first time in the history of the world that the communist government has been overthrown by the people. And for that, we congratulate you and the people of Guatemala for the support they have given. And we are sure that under your leadership, supported by the people whom I have met by the hundreds on my visit to Guatemala, that Guatemala is going to enter a new era in which there will be prosperity for the people together with liberty for the people.
I founded the Historical Memory Project in 2001, when I organized the first conference for the project to create a forum to discuss the genocide in Guatemala, because in 2000 I came back from Guatemala after 3 years of working with the UN Truth Commission, collecting war survivors' testimonies, field work that we did for about a year in the highlands of Guatemala. And so when I came back to the States, well, first I was struck by the lack of discussion there is currently with regards to indigenous peoples in the Latin American context, and also the lack of discussion of academic or scholarly discussion about genocide and state violence during the Cold War years. In the context of a 36-year war, civil war in Guatemala, the Guatemalan state committed genocide against at least that we documented 4 indigenous groups. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas continue to be a vulnerable population targeted for elimination by the state. I took testimonies of war survivors there, massacres, smashing babies against trees and raping women and all the terrible things that we learned through the collection of testimonies. But I think that the most important thing to understand is how U.S. ideologies of national security doctrine resonated with local ideologies that polarized and fragmented society with this notion of the internal enemy. The ideology behind the national security doctrine that was implemented throughout the Americas during the Cold War years said that there was an enemy inside the population, not outside, because armies supposedly are supposed to protect borders from an external enemy. But the national security doctrine said to the military, local armies over there, was to say, look, you need to find terrorists or the internal enemy inside the country. So anyone could, was perceived by the army, by militaries and death squads and paramilitary forces as the internal enemy. What that did was to turn people against each other. Indigenous communities are usually very tight. People rely on each other, families rely on each other. It's very different from the Western notion of neighborhoods or communities. In Guatemala, indigenous people depend on each other for survival. So when you insert fear and you insert within the community, at the heart of the communities, this notion of the internal enemy, the impact was terrible, again, because you fragmented families and entire communities that became suspicious to one another. Trust and solidarity within these communities have been very difficult to rebuild, and that, to me, it's very important to consider when we look at atrocities in Latin America. What has been the aftermath of these atrocities, the long-lasting consequences of violence?